Good evening. Old Testament studies time. We're in the book of Jonah. If you're just starting right here on Sunday night with me, I wish you'd click off and go back and watch the Sunday morning message this morning. We preached on the book of Jonah. We've made it to chapter 2 in our studies. And I brought something I wanted to share to you before we even read chapter 2, which chapter 2 is a prayer that Jonah prayed when he was in the whale's belly. But I ran across something in my studies last night that I thought, I want to share this with you. This is a little commentary. J. Vernon McGee, my dad gave me this set of commentaries when I first started preaching years ago. I like it because it's 4 or 5 pages a chapter as opposed to my pulpit commentary over here that you can read all week long on one chapter. But this is something just good to brush up and get ready for a chapter like this. But there was some interesting stuff that Dr. McGee had collected and put in this commentary about newspaper clippings, etc., that have happened in modern times that people have fell overboard and been swallowed by a whale or a great fish. And let me just read this to you. I think there's 6 instances here. There are at least 2 known monsters of the deep who could easily have swallowed Jonah. They are the Balanoptera musculus, or the sulfur bottom whale, and the Rhinodon typicus, or whale shark. Sulfur bottom whale or whale shark. Neither of these monsters of the deep have any teeth. They feed in an interesting way by opening their enormous mouths, submerging their lower jaw, and rushing through the water at terrific speed. After straining out the water, they swallow whatever's left. A sulfur bottom whale 100 feet long was captured off of Cape Cod in 1933. His mouth was 10 or 12 feet wide, so he could have easily swallowed a horse. These whales have 4 to 6 compartments in their stomachs, in any one of which a colony of men could find free lodging. They might even have a choice of rooms, for in the head of this whale is a wonderful air storage chamber, an enlargement of the nasal sinus, often measuring 7 feet high, 7 feet wide, and 14 feet long. If he has an unwelcome guest on board who gives him a headache, the whale swims to the nearest land and gets rid of the offender, as did Jonah. The Cleveland Plain Dealer recently quoted an article by Dr. Ransom Harvey, who said that a dog was lost overboard from a ship. It was found in the head of a whale 6 days later, alive and barking. Frank Bullen wrote The Cruise of the Cathalot, tells of a shark 15 feet in length which was found in the stomach of a whale. He says that when dying, the whale ejects the contents of its stomach. The late Dr. Dixon stated that in a museum in Beirut, Lebanon, there was a head of a whale shark big enough to swallow the largest man that history records. He also tells of a white shark of the Mediterranean which swallowed a whole horse. Another swallowed a reindeer, minus only its horns. And still another Mediterranean white shark was found a whole sea cow, about the size of an ox. These facts show that Jonah could have been swallowed by either a whale or a shark. But as any other man besides Jonah has been swallowed and lived to tell the tale. We know of 2 such instances. The famous French scientist M.D. Parville writes of James Bartley, who in the region of Falkland Islands near South America was supposed to have been drowned at sea. 2 days after his disappearance, the sailors made a catch of a whale. When it was cut up, much to their surprise, they found their missing friend alive, but unconscious inside the whale. He revived and has been enjoying the best of health ever since his adventure. Number 6, Dr. Harry Rimmer, president of the Research Science Bureau of Los Angeles, writes of another case. In the Literary Digest, we notice an account of an English sailor who was swallowed by a gigantic rhinodon in the English Channel. Briefly, the account stated that in the attempt to harpoon one of these monstrous sharks, the sailor fell overboard, and before he could be picked up again, the shark turned and engulfed him. 48 hours after the accident occurred, the fish was sighted and slain. When the shark was opened by the sailors, they were amazed to find the man unconscious but alive. He was rushed to the hospital where he was found to be suffering from shock alone and A few hours later was discharged as being physically fit. The account concluded by saying that the man was on exhibit in a London museum at a shilling admittance fee, being advertised as the Jonah of the 20th century. In 1926, Dr. Rimmer met this man and writes that his physical appearance was odd. His body was devoid of hair, and patches of yellowish brown color covered his entire skin. If two men could exist for 2 days and nights inside of marine monsters, could not a prophet of God, under his direct care and protection, stand the experience a day and a night longer? So why should we doubt God's word? All right, I thought that was interesting. Let's pick up with Jonah chapter 2 now. Short 10 verses in this chapter. And it begins with verse 1 that says, then, it's an important word, then, remember what happened in chapter 1? The storms hit the pagan sailors. They said, we ain't never been in a storm so bad. And they asked Jonah, said, why is this happening to us? He said, because I'm disobeying God and God's after me. Throw me overboard and you'll live. Jonah knew he was out of the will of God. Throw me overboard and try to save your own lives. And then he threw him overboard, and the whale, the great fish, swallows Jonah. And then, that's the word, first word of chapter 2. Then Jonah prayed. Maybe he should have been praying and getting back in God's will before now and saved himself a lot of trouble. And you can too when we get out of God's will. But then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God out of the fish's belly, and said, I cried by reason of mine affliction to the Lord, and he heard me. He'll hear you too. Out of the belly of hell, or in the Old Testament Hebrew here, it's a Sheol, sometimes translated hell, sometimes translated grave or underworld. In this case, I'd say to Jonah, it was like he was in the grave. He was in the belly of the whale. He calls it here, the translator of King James Version says, it's out of the belly of hell, or Sheol, cried I, and you heard my voice. For thou hast cast me into the deep, in the midst of the seas, and the floods compassed or encircled me about, and all thy billows and thy waves passed over me. Verse 4, then said I am cast out of thy sight. But he wasn't. God still saw Jonah when he was in the belly of that whale down in the bottom of the ocean. Jonah couldn't see God at this point, but his faith's waking up and looking to him, ain't it? I'm cast out of thy sight, yet I will look again toward thy holy temple. Remember the Jews back then, they'd pray toward Jerusalem. I don't know how Jonah would have known what direction Jerusalem was, but that means I'm going to pray. The waters compassed me about, even to the soul. The depth closed me round about. The weeds were wrapped around my head. I went down to the bottoms of the mountains. The earth with her bars was round me forever. Yet thou hast brought up my life from corruption. Naturally, he's writing this afterwards, right? O Lord my God, you saved me from corruption, from the grave. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord. I always think of that verse that says in Psalms, I think it says, maybe it's Proverbs, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. Well, sometimes you look at them and think, well, they've departed from it, but the hope is that one of these days, things get bad, and they'll remember their training. I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came in unto thee in your holy temple. Verse 8 is kind of a curious verse that's here. It's almost like a proverb in the middle of Jonah's prayer. And nobody's sure what it means, but I'll tell you what I think it means. I haven't read this anywhere else, but it's just me. Jonah in his prayer said, they that observe lying vanities forsake their own mercy. I think it was Jonah's way of telling the Lord that I believed the lie that I could run away from you and get away from you. And he said, I forsook my own mercy by doing that. He's learned his lesson. But now he's learned it, and he says, even though he's in the whale's belly, what time he's got left, and Jonah's probably thinking during this prayer that he's not going to have time to finish the prayer and he's going to be dead, but he said, what time I've got left, I will sacrifice unto thee. Well, how's he going to sacrifice? He ain't got nothing in there to sacrifice with. He's going to sacrifice with the voice of thanksgiving. That's what Christians do. We offer the Lord the sacrifice of thanksgiving when we're singing. And I'll pay that I've vowed. And then he makes maybe the most important statement here in the book of Jonah. He says, salvation is of the Lord. And see, that's the fact. That's a New Testament truth too, ain't that? We can't save ourselves, It's only God that can save us. We can just receive his salvation. And just like Jonah, there wasn't nothing Jonah could do to direct that whale to swim to a beach and spit him out somewhere. It was all entirely in the hands of God. So that's all we can do is we can just turn to God and we trust him for our salvation, because salvation is of God. We can't work our way into it. We just receive the salvation which is of the Lord. And the Lord spake unto the fish. The fish is more obedient than God's prophet was. The Lord spake to the fish, and it vomited out Jonah upon the dry land. So there's old Jonah. He got to where God was sending him to, and the long, hard way. He had to go to the school of hard knocks, didn't he? And it would have been a much more direct and pleasurable way if he'd have just did what God told him to do to start with. But people, that's the human condition. People learn that over and over in their lifetime. They can look back and say, you know what, if I'd just done it God's way to start with, I'd have saved myself a whole lot of trouble. We'll see you next week for chapter 3.